within a life and a reign that in one sense is action-packed, and yet in another sense, Elizabeth spends a very long time attempting not to do things. So even though there's a lot going on in terms of her actions, it wasn't that I had a hugely driving narrative in terms of she did this and then she did that. Actually, she took up positions and then attempted not to move from them. So there were all sorts of challenges.
Yeah, you cast her passivity sometimes as quite an active position to be in.
That's absolutely how I came to see it. I wanted this book to be a psychological portrait, and I knew where I was going to start. I didn't know where it was going to take me. I discovered that as I wrote, and where I wanted to start, I knew where I wanted to start, was the day in May 1536 when her mother walked onto the scaffold and had her head cut off on the orders of her father. And I think that one of the main things I had in mind approaching her life was the sense that we know the story very well. We know the whole story of the Tudors. We know Henry VIII and his 6 wives. We know Elizabeth very well, or we think we do. But because we know how everything turns out, I'm not sure we spend enough time thinking about the human reality of living through it. And that moment when her mother was killed on the orders of her father before she was 3 years old, her mother being the first noble woman to be executed, to be judicially murdered in England that I could think of, at any rate, certainly the first anointed queen, that was absolutely shocking, absolutely unprecedented. It ushered in a new kind of politics, a kind of politics that became a bit of a bloodbath under Henry VIII. So to try to work out what it was like to grow up, that's the kind of insecurity I'm talking about, not a kind of waking up in the morning full of self-doubt. Elizabeth was not full of self-doubt, but she was trying to negotiate a world that was full of threat from her very earliest days. And it's that context in which her fondness for deciding where to stand and then standing still there and resisting attempts to make her move, I think that then becomes very interesting as an active strategy rather than just she's not very decisive. I think she was very decisive.
It feels like I have read lots of other books about Elizabeth that have criticised her for that. And yet you flipped the whole thing on its head and said, I mean, you absolutely made Elizabeth feel like she was pulling strings rather than being manipulated by various people. And particularly even as a very young woman, some of those early writings and poems that you talked about really give you a little insight into the young Elizabeth. I mean, she's very young at that point, in her teens, trying to survive.
Very young and confronted with extraordinary danger. There was a letter that she wrote to her brother Edward when he was king, when she was 14. And one line leapt out at me. I mean, it's leapt out at other historians. I'm not the first person to see it, but it just seemed so much an encapsulation of what was already becoming her character, her instinct, her way of dealing with the world. And she said something like, it is in my nature, as your Majesty already knows, not to say in words as much as I think in my mind. And that sense of guardedness, of opacity, of such a lot going on, such a lot of strategic thinking, and yet the difficulty that the people around her had in reading what she was thinking and saying and doing. And then actually at the same time, I found myself moving between that sense of how difficult she was to read, which her contemporaries said, that the people didn't know why she was doing what she was doing or how to interpret what she said. And then other times it felt as though she was absolutely standing in plain sight, saying exactly what she meant, and no one was listening, or certainly taking her seriously. Her marriage being a wonderful example of that.
Yeah, good point. So let's talk about her as a princess, or as a sort of weird princess, because her father delegitimized her, but also kept her in the line of succession. So talk to me about how she navigated the reign of her brother and sister.
With very great care. You're absolutely right about Henry VIII. He is one of the greatest exemplars in history of the man who always wanted to have his cake and eat it. Perhaps we should put him in charge of the Brexit negotiations. But that worked for as long as he was calling the shots, for as long as he was alive. Essentially, what it did was store up problems for when he was dead. So to say that both of his daughters were illegitimate and yet to put them in the line of succession meant that there were questions to ask which no one was brave enough to ask him, but of course broke out into the open as soon as he wasn't there. Elizabeth was, broadly speaking, okay during her brother's reign. She was a Protestant. She had no choice about being a Protestant given the circumstances of her birth. She was, in many ways, the physical embodiment of the English Reformation, but kept her head down in her books, apart from her extraordinary entanglement with her brother's uncle, Thomas Seymour, who became her father-in-law shockingly quickly after her father's death by marrying Catherine Parr, the Queen Dowager. And Elizabeth was living with Catherine Parr and then with Thomas Seymour when he came to join the household.
And how much older was he than her?
Oh, he was in his 30s and she was 14 going on 15.
Well, 30 is still very young.
Very, very young,
okay,
but,
so
but
he
not
was 20
quite
years older.
as
He was 20
young
years older. Okay.
as her. She carried on living in the household for a while and then rather precipitately left during Catherine Parr's pregnancy. And what came out afterwards was that there had been some really inappropriate behaviour going on in that household. Tickling early in the morning when no one's properly dressed yet. Now, Elizabeth was not alone with him, these early morning visits, when sometimes just Thomas Seymour and sometimes Thomas Seymour and Catherine Parr would come to see her in the mornings. She had all her ladies in waiting around her. And yet this was a kind of intimacy that was certainly not proper in the normal sense of the word. And what came out after Catherine Parr's death was that Thomas Seymour had designs on Elizabeth. He'd married the Queen Dowager. In the end, she died in childbirth. What next marriage would serve his unquenchable ambition? And Elizabeth was clearly taken with him. She, it was said, blushed at the mention of his name. She didn't resist these games, these flirtatious games that got played. But what she discovered when Thomas Seymour was arrested and accused of treason was just how dangerous that kind of flirtation could be. And she really, on her own at the age of 15, with her closest servants taken into custody for questioning, she had no one else to protect her. She had to stand on her own 2 feet at that point, and she did so with remarkable aplomb and remarkable strategic flair. She knew, she took up a position. She said, yes, maybe marriage had been discussed, but only if the council agreed, and that she had never done anything improper, and she would not budge from that position. And the man who was in charge of questioning her initially said, yes, I'll have results for you within a day or two. By the end of the week, he was saying, this is impossible. You can't get anything out of her.
And presume that sort of very powerful lesson, because she never let herself be compromised like that again, or open herself to potential compromise.
Well, I think what the lesson was is very interesting. I think she had already, I think we have to factor in what had happened to her before this point. I think for your father to have married your mother for love and lust, then to have killed her before you were 3, then later to have married your mother's cousin and done the same again. In between, you've lost another stepmother to childbirth. Another stepmother got out safe and sound by not actually marrying your father. Another stepmother survived until she too had to give birth. It's not a very happy set of precedents for the prospect of romantic entanglement, sexual entanglement, marriage. Thomas Seymour may have been an appealing prospect, it seems to me, because at that point she was going to have to marry someone if she wasn't in charge of her own destiny. And most royal princesses got sent abroad to marry a man they'd never met, never laid eyes on, and would never see their home again, in which case someone she did rather like the company of, who would allow her to stay at home, might well have been a very appealing prospect of the ones that were on offer to her. But at the point when that all crashes and burns, the renewed lesson that love, sex, marriage were dangerous can only have been very powerful. The other thing that's interesting to me, though, is that she doesn't renounce this completely. She doesn't become a sort of virginal figure who will never be in the company of men. She liked men. She liked charming men. She liked charming, good-looking men. And she did get herself into a spot of trouble as queen with Robert Dudley, her favourite, who she adored. And she adored his company, and gossip raced not only around England but also around the whole of Europe about what they might be getting up to. And there's a rather poignant moment, I think, very early in her reign, where one of her closest women servants, Kate Ashley, who had been her governess, goes to her and says, "I'm worried about what you're doing to your reputation by dallying with Robert Dudley in this way." And she says, "I have so much sorrow and tribulation in my life and so little joy. Can't I be allowed this pleasure?" And I felt for her so much, because she clearly wanted that kind of human contact, but couldn't go any further than that.
I really like the idea. You paint her as being in an impossible position around marriage, because you either marry a foreign prince, and then that's the unacceptable prospect of a foreign competitor coming over and having this exalted role in English society and within the state, like Philip II had done with her sister, or she marries someone domestically and upsets the very finely balanced domestic, social and political hierarchy of the country. So it's very hard to see who she could have married and maintained her own position and respect and kept a homogenous ruling class.
She could not win. I mean, this was a lose-lose situation, it seems to me, and it's one of the many ways in which being a female ruler confronted her with dilemmas that a male ruler never had to deal with. Who could she marry? If she did marry abroad, as you say, the risk is that a foreigner is coming over here, taking over our government. But also, if you're a woman marrying a foreign prince, a queen regnant marrying a foreign prince, you have to marry someone whose status is appropriate to your own. But if you do that, you lock your kingdom into an alliance that's going to be very hard to shift, in a way that a king marrying a foreign princess is not making a decision forever. Henry VIII marrying Catherine of Aragon did not mean that he and Spain would forever be locked together. Mary marrying Philip did mean that she and Spain would forever be locked together. So Elizabeth can only keep her options open in terms of diplomacy if she doesn't marry. If she keeps thinking about marriage, or saying she's thinking about marriage, but not actually taking the decision, that leaves her space within international diplomacy, space to move, as long as she doesn't actually commit.
Then we should talk about the religious settlement, which people obviously find a bit tricky nowadays, but it is fascinating because it shows her approach to politics. England had veered between Catholicism, Protestantism, renewed Catholicism. What did Elizabeth try to do to ensure that everybody could sing from the same hymn sheet? Excuse the bad pun.
She tried to take up we need to be careful what we mean by saying this, but a kind of middling position that would create the broadest possible church within which her subjects could gather in obedience to her own sovereignty. England's religious history had, as you say, veered between the religious extremes, and it had done so over a very short time, from the 1530s when Henry's reforms started taking effect to the 1550s when Elizabeth came to the throne in 1558. That's only 20 years. And so religious change had been massive, religious violence had been massive, and nothing had quite bedded down what was the Church of England going to be. The interesting thing about what Elizabeth did in 1559, I think, is that she took up a position doctrinally and in terms of the functioning of her church that very few other people would actually support. The Catholics, the bishops who were still in position at the end of Mary's reign, obviously didn't support a renewed break from Rome. But the Protestants, who were very pleased to see Elizabeth on the throne, didn't support what she was doing either. They wanted to go much further. And so she took up, in a way very like her father, she took up a position that was very distinctively hers, that was Protestant. It did break from Rome, but it allowed some room for manoeuvre on the key doctrines, for instance, what was actually happening during communion, what was happening to the bread and the wine. There was some room for manoeuvre on that. She kept a lot of ritual that she was clearly very fond of. Her bishops didn't want to be made to wear all these vestments that she insisted they put on. And she hated preaching, so she was going to put up with as little of it as possible. And she hated preaching partly, I think, because she didn't like being lectured, and partly because preaching to her was dangerous. It was a way.
There's always a whiff of sedition about preaching.
Exactly. Who knows what's being said out there as these congregations are massing around these firebrand preachers giving their unlicensed sermons. So what she wanted was maximum participation and maximum obedience, maximum security, really. And she held that line for a long time. It was a line that got harder and harder to hold, but she absolutely clung to it for as long as she could.
Now, in the book, you do give her a little bit of an easy time about killing and torturing so many people.
Well, I wasn't trying to give her an easy time. Again, one of the difficulties is compression. What I was trying to do, I think, was to show how this attempt to hold a religious line spirals out of control. Her ministers see danger everywhere. They see Catholics within England as a kind of fifth column, a sleeper cell waiting to be activated into dreadful, dreadful danger. So they're always pushing for more clampdowns, more restrictive laws and practices against Catholics. Elizabeth does resist that because I think she sees that if you bring in more repressive measures, you force Catholics to choose. She didn't want them to. She wanted loyal Catholic subjects to be able to find a way to keep obeying her, to keep supporting her, to keep upholding her sovereignty. But the more repressive you are, the more they're having to choose between being a Catholic and being an Englishman or woman. And, of course, the Catholic powers on the continent and the Pope in particular, in a sense, don't help her. There's a pincer movement with her own ministers in 1570 at the point where the Pope excommunicates her. The danger is ramped up and it becomes this kind of vicious spiral where there are more Catholic plots against her, but her ministers are looking for Catholic plots in order to justify more brutal and repressive measures. I'm not letting Elizabeth off the hook. Absolutely, there was appalling violence visited upon Catholic missionaries and Catholic suspects as the plots became ever more pressing.
I mean, we're judging her harshly because she's a woman. I mean, we wouldn't be having this discussion if it was Henry VIII lopping people's heads off all over the place.
That is something that absolutely struck me so forcibly, the deeper into the book I got. People at the time and since have written about Elizabeth as being vacillating, emotional, changing her mind. You couldn't pin her down. Yeah, okay, she didn't like taking decisions. She particularly didn't like taking decisions that were going to have very big repercussions. The execution of Mary Queen of Scots being a prime example. She resisted that to the very last moment and beyond. But it seems to me she had very good reasons for resisting that. And what happens as soon as you've got rid of Mary Queen of Scots and all the plotting that she's the centre of? The Armada turns up. And that's not coincidental. Once Mary's gone, her claim to the English throne passes to Philip of Spain. And therefore he launches his Armada to invade England and take it over as he is duty-bound to do. If we're looking in the Tudor dynasty for a ruler who made emotional decisions and changed his mind all the time, I'd be looking at Henry VIII. I would not be looking at Elizabeth. He seems to me one of the most emotional decision makers among England's monarchs taken as a whole.
And then, of course, we got Charles I coming not long after.
Mm-hmm.